Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. What is a stage in AWS CodePipeline? A logical collection of actions. A type of AWS Lambda function. An Amazon EC2 instance. A security group in AWS. A stage in AWS CodePipeline is a logical collection of actions that are grouped together to represent a part of your release process. How does AWS CodePipeline handle failures during pipeline execution? By stopping execution and notifying via Amazon SNS. By deleting the pipeline and artifacts. By automatically retrying failed actions. By terminating all associated Amazon EC2 instances. AWS CodePipeline handles failures by stopping execution upon encountering a failure and notifying via Amazon SNS. What action type in AWS CodePipeline is used for deploying applications to AWS Lambda functions? AWS CloudFormation. AWS CodeDeploy. AWS Lambda. AWS EC2. AWS Lambda is the action type used for deploying applications to AWS Lambda functions within AWS CodePipeline. When configuring a stage in AWS CodePipeline, what is the purpose of transition settings? To provision Amazon RDS instances. To manage Amazon S3 storage. To configure AWS IAM roles. To define the flow of pipeline execution between stages. Transition settings in AWS CodePipeline are used to define how pipeline execution moves from one stage to another, ensuring the flow of deployment. How does AWS CodePipeline handle the source stage in a pipeline? By monitoring Amazon VPC flow logs. By triggering AWS Lambda functions. By performing static code analysis. By retrieving the latest revision of the source code. AWS CodePipeline handles the source stage by retrieving the latest revision of the source code from the configured source provider. What AWS service is commonly used for manual approval actions in AWS CodePipeline? Amazon SQS. AWS IAM. Amazon SNS. AWS Step Functions. Amazon SNS is commonly used for manual approval actions in AWS CodePipeline to notify stakeholders for approval steps in the pipeline. What is the primary purpose of AWS CodePipeline? To perform data analytics. To monitor Amazon EC2 instances. To manage AWS IAM policies. To orchestrate and automate the continuous integration and delivery pipeline. AWS CodePipeline's primary purpose is to orchestrate and automate continuous integration and delivery pipelines. What is the purpose of using AWS CodePipeline alongside AWS CloudFormation? To create Amazon S3 buckets. To automate infrastructure provisioning. To manage Amazon RDS databases. To monitor AWS CloudTrail logs. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS CloudFormation to automate the provisioning of AWS infrastructure resources defined in CloudFormation templates. What is the typical role of AWS CodeBuild in AWS CodePipeline? To configure AWS IAM roles. To deploy applications to Amazon EC2 instances. To build and package source code. To manage Amazon Route 53 DNS records. AWS CodeBuild in AWS CodePipeline is typically used to build, test, and package source code before deploying it using subsequent pipeline stages. How does AWS CodePipeline integrate with AWS CodeDeploy? As a data warehousing solution. As an action provider. As a content delivery network. As a serverless compute service. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS CodeDeploy as an action provider to facilitate automated deployments of applications managed by CodePipeline. What is the typical role of AWS CodeDeploy in AWS CodePipeline? To manage Amazon CloudFront distributions. To automate application deployments. To monitor AWS CloudWatch logs. To configure AWS IAM roles. AWS CodeDeploy and AWS CodePipeline is typically used to automate the deployment of applications to fleets of Amazon EC2 instances, ensuring consistent and efficient deployment processes. What is the typical role of AWS CodeBuild in AWS CodePipeline? To build and package source code. To deploy applications to Amazon EC2 instances. To manage Amazon Route 53 DNS records. To configure AWS IAM roles. AWS CodeBuild in AWS CodePipeline is typically used to build, test, and package source code before deploying it using subsequent pipeline stages. What is the primary benefit of using AWS CodePipeline? Backup and restore capabilities. Cost reduction for Amazon EC2 instances. Continuous integration and delivery. Security monitoring. The primary benefit of AWS CodePipeline is enabling continuous integration and delivery practices. What is the purpose of using AWS CodePipeline with AWS Elastic Beanstalk? To automate application deployments. To monitor AWS CloudTrail logs. To create Amazon S3 buckets. To manage AWS IAM users. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS Elastic Beanstalk to automate the deployment of applications managed by Elastic Beanstalk, ensuring consistent and reliable application updates. What is an action in AWS CodePipeline? An AWS IAM user. An AWS S3 bucket. A type of Amazon RDS database instance. A task performed on a deployment artifact. An action in AWS CodePipeline represents a single task performed on the artifacts of your application's source, such as deploying to a server or validating the build. What does AWS CodePipeline use to define the sequence of actions in a pipeline? A pipeline definition. An Amazon SNS topic. An AWS SQSQ. An AWS IAM role. AWS CodePipeline uses a pipeline definition to specify the sequence of actions that are to be executed in the pipeline. What is the typical role of Amazon S3 in AWS CodePipeline? To provide data analytics. To store pipeline artifacts. To host static websites. To manage AWS IAM users. Amazon S3 in AWS CodePipeline is primarily used to store pipeline artifacts, such as build outputs and deployment packages, during the execution of pipelines. What is a common use case for AWS CodePipeline? Creating Amazon EC2 instances. Automating software release pipelines. Configuring AWS IAM policies. Monitoring Amazon S3 buckets. A common use case for AWS CodePipeline is automating the release pipelines for software applications, enabling continuous integration and delivery practices. What is the typical role of AWS CodeDeploy in AWS CodePipeline? To deploy applications to a fleet of Amazon EC2 instances. To manage AWS IAM roles. To monitor AWS CloudTrail logs. To store application source code. AWS CodeDeploy is used in AWS CodePipeline to automate the deployment of applications to a fleet of Amazon EC2 instances. What is the purpose of an AWS CloudFormation action in AWS CodePipeline? To manage Amazon RDS databases. To provision AWS infrastructure. To create Amazon Redshift clusters. To monitor AWS CloudWatch logs. An AWS CloudFormation action in AWS CodePipeline is used to provision AWS infrastructure resources defined in CloudFormation templates as part of the pipeline. How does AWS CodePipeline facilitate integration with third-party services? Through AWS IAM roles. Through Amazon S3 buckets. Through Amazon RDS connections. Through webhook integrations. AWS CodePipeline facilitates integration with third-party services through webhook integrations, allowing external events to trigger pipeline executions automatically. How does AWS CodePipeline integrate with AWS CodeCommit? As a database service. As a source provider. As a machine learning tool. As an email service. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS CodeCommit as a source provider to retrieve the source code for applications managed in the pipeline. How does AWS CodePipeline handle the source stage in a pipeline? By performing static code analysis. By triggering AWS Lambda functions. By retrieving the latest revision of the source code. By monitoring Amazon VPC flow logs. AWS CodePipeline handles the source stage by retrieving the latest revision of the source code from the configured source provider. What is an artifact in the context of AWS CodePipeline? An AWS IAM role. An Amazon VPC endpoint. An Amazon S3 bucket. A version file or set of files. An artifact in AWS CodePipeline refers to a version file or set of files produced by a pipeline's actions, such as build outputs or deployment packages. How does AWS CodePipeline integrate with AWS CodeBuild? As a database service. As a serverless compute service. As a managed Kubernetes service. As an action provider. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS CodeBuild as an action provider to perform build tasks within the pipeline. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.